Fiona, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we live in a world that is increasingly shaped by AI. Why is knowing who you are more important than ever?
I'll give a short answer. I think it's because so much of our lives are being disrupted. So much of our what we know as our identity is being disrupted by AI that it's so important to know what we genuinely believe ourselves to be, where our worth is, how we understand ourselves, so that that disruption doesn't send us completely off course, but allows us to grow and to adapt and to change. And it makes it sound like some easy thing to do. It's like, oh, I'll understand myself better. But it's obviously a lot more complex than that. But I think it's an opportunity that people reach sometimes through major life transitions. So it might usually be reached through something like a bereavement, divorce, retirement. And AI is forcing the questions that people would normally face at those times um, in a much more rapid way. And of course, it's on a bigger scale than it has been previously.
What are some of the risks of not knowing who we are in a world increasingly shaped by AI?
I think the risks is it could feel existential. So if we think about those times in life that I think most of us have encountered where we feel like we've suddenly lost our way or something's been pulled from under us because life has changed in some way, whether that's been expected or unexpected. Um, so the feeling can be existential. I think the practical risk is en masse looking at a lot of people who are feeling that. So they're
Mm.
unsettled. They're therefore underperforming. If you talk about a work environment, well-being suffers, stress increases, burnout increases. And then I think from the perspective of really needing people to understand how to tap into what we call human capabilities. And at the moment, a lot of organizations are saying, yeah, we need human skills, which I think is fantastic because, these are the things that I've been arguing for years. But we can't just like plaster them on top of something. It's like building a house without any foundations. And I think this understanding of ourselves is really fundamental. And AI can just magnify um, the experience of not having a stable foundation.
Mm. It might also be why so many people are reporting a group amnesia, or I don't know if you've heard of the Mandela effect. There's this whole movement. People can search it on YouTube. Some are saying that something happened at the Large Hadron Collider in, in Switzerland, and it's created a glitch in reality. And there's all of these things that people remember which have glitched. But it might just be that we're losing touch with who we are and the fabric of what we see as reality. It's changing because we've got this intelligence infused into everything, instant answers.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I think that AI is not the only thing. I think there are so many factors that are changing so rapidly. And, we don't have such strong communities. That's not news, but technology is advancing at a faster rate, not just AI. And then you bring quantum into the equation, as it were, as well. But there are all these factors around the fact that people move job roles more frequently, people move countries, people um, don't have a sense of identity and worth built through religion or society in the same way. I think you put all of these things together and they create this instability. And then I think the political instability and war and all of the other things that are going on in the world also serve as a magnifier for that. So AI is one element of it, and it's probably, you could say it's the most obvious magnifier, but I don't think it's the only one.
Mm. Now, you are a psychologist, award winning author. You've spent 25 years working with people at every extreme, from disadvantaged young people through to Olympic athletes, surgeons, CEOs. Why do you do what you do, and what got you into this field?
I think initially I was always interested in people. I think we're all interested in people, but I was probably obsessively interested in people. And I also wanted to work myself out. I think when I was going through that existential crisis, as a teenager that many of us did, I was like, why do I feel like this? Why am I like this? And I think that probably sparked an interest, which then took us sort of like a slightly squiggly route, as often careers do. Um, and I came back to it because fundamentally, I am just so curious about people, what makes people who they are. And although it sounds really corny, how to help people live more fulfilled lives. Um, and so one of the things I always say is, I do work with people who are top surgeons, world class CEOs, but I don't think success necessarily is what makes people fulfilled. And what I've learned from hearing thousands of stories over the years, I've really been passionate about sharing with young people because equally I feel that everyone has potential. Everyone has a story. Everyone has something that matters, something of worth. And I think if we can help people recognize that and get in touch with that earlier on in life, then it puts them in a much better position to succeed in that success is fulfillment.
Very interesting. I've been talking about fulfillment as more important than success for a long, long time. So very aligned with you there because you can find great fulfillment just raising a family. You don't have to be a
Hmm.
CEO or just helping with some environmental initiatives or whatever it might be. There's very different versions of fulfillment, and that's why it's the top of the values pyramid in my book. Um, Returning back to identity. So AI disruption is an identity crisis, not a skills gap. That's something I've heard you talk about. I think people feel less grounded. There's also way more competing for our attention than ever before. And there's this risk that I've heard you talk about, which is identity by osmosis. What does that actually mean?
So it's really about how we become something without even realizing we've become it. And I think there's different layers to that. So there's things like we might turn around and someone says, "Oh, you, everyone buys the same sort of car around here," and you think, "Oh, not me. I don't. I'm not influenced by that." And then you look around and you think, yeah, I have got a similar car to everyone else I know, or I do wear a similar sort of brand of jeans, so there's all these little things that are influencing us all the time that we don't notice. And particularly as adults, I think when we're younger, we look at teenagers, even as a teenager, you are very aware that you're being influenced by your peers. But as later in life, in adult development, we don't notice, but we are being influenced just as much. So there are studies that show that happiness is impacts that sort of thing. It's not just your friends, but it's your friends' friends, and your friends' friends' friends will be happier if you're happier. There's studies looking at people putting on weight, and weight gain is significantly higher if someone who's close to you, emotionally close to you, puts on weight. Now, I'm not saying there's a bad, there's a good, there's a bad. These are just facts. But what's interesting now is there are so many, like you say, competing things that are entering into that. So there's social media, there's your news recommendation, the feed, there's the algorithms, there's the uh, commentary on the one hand of saying, like, find yourself, be an individual. But on the other hand, we have less and less guidance or less given to us. Um, and so the osmosis piece it's basically the way we have evolved to survive in a social environment. And I think everybody knows that, everyone's sort of, that's one of the things that I think has moved quickly is this understanding of psychology now. So evolutionary psychology, 10 years ago, I would have had to explain it to someone. Now everyone really knows what it means. Um, but it's through that need to belong to a group and to be part of the tribe. That's where it stems from. But the thing I think we forget is how it's happening all the time unconsciously. And when there are a huge number of influences that we're not aware of actually pulling us in different directions.
That's interesting. And being aware of who you're absorbing from is important. So is it about being more intentional when we consume content, and even about the friends that we surround ourselves with to some degree?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because there's an amazing program at a university near here. So I'm in Los Angeles, and it's a university that's seventh in the country for social mobility. And they have a program called the Educational Opportunity Program. And I've been talking to some of the young people there. And this one young guy who was in his second year now at university was never expected to go to university, grew up in a trailer park, never even had a bed, um, was saying how he changed his views about a lot of things when he started on this intensive program. And he was surrounded by people at first. He was like, well, they're literally from a different gang. So he's like, well, I'm not, or there were people who were different sexual orientation, different ethnicity, different religion than he was used to. And it was very much he'd grown up in an environment where you protect yourself and you hold your own in what you are and who you are, and you keep everyone else out. And that changed over this intensive 6-week program. And now he says he doesn't disown his old friends, but he's very aware of the influence that they will have on him. And he makes most of his time intentional with the people that he has met since. And I think that's a beautiful way of looking at it, because often when we start talking about things like this, people think, well, does that mean that I have to not talk to my friend who's, who has put on weight, who's this person who's really negative, or should I not be near them? Should I? No, it's like you say, it's about the intentionality of it. And I think he beautifully described something that I've often explained the science of, or the social neuroscience behind it, in a way that was perfect, because it was saying, yes, be more intentional. Just think about it. It doesn't mean, cutting people out of your life.
Mm. It does explain why, in my own experience, travel is an amazing way to reinvent yourself, to
Yeah.
rediscover or reconnect with your essence in a way, because I've found that you get set in habits because of the environment that you're in, what you're doing, who you're associating with, and then lifting yourself up and dumping yourself. For example, in India, I went there and I had been feeling pretty burnt out running a digital agency in Sydney, Australia, and I was clinically depressed for sure. As soon as I moved location, there was this opportunity to completely rebuild from the ground up who I was, what was important, and it made a massive difference. And then moved multiple times over the course of my life and career. And each time there's an opportunity. Do you think that that's something people should consider?
I think it's really interesting because while you're saying that, I'm thinking you've actually
Hmm.
got what we would call identity coherence, which is you've probably got pretty stable identity underneath everything. So when something changes, it allows you to sort of get rid of the periphery, the things that aren't
Mm,
actually helpful to you, and to restart. But you're actually not reinventing as much as you're re-anchoring.
that's true.
Um, but if someone doesn't have that coherence, so I think there's one statistic that 65% of US university students currently have identity incoherence. So if you take someone with an incoherent identity, so an unstable identity, it might not look obvious that that's unstable. They may not even realize, but you take something away and it can be incredibly destabilizing. So, in the same way that AI can be, or I mean, a better example is I think probably think about people as they retire. So, you need some people like they go into retirement and they're loving life and it's like, this is great. Some people just don't know what to do with themselves. They can get very depressed, they can get very lost. Um, and that can be a lack of a stable identity, or their identity is being pinned too much to one thing, which may have been, for example, work. And so I think, yes, it is a good thing to do, but I think first of all, it's sort of exploring how solid is that base for me. And clues can be when things have changed dramatically in my life, how have I coped with that?
That makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. I never thought of that. And what are some examples of this identity incoherence with younger people particularly? And where do you think it comes from? Is it being influenced by perhaps your home environment, how you grew up, and then what you've learned subsequently, and then, just the conflicting information that we find everywhere? I know increasingly I talk to people who say, I don't know what to believe because two different news channels tell me completely different stories about the same event and my social feed is different again.
That's exactly it. And that, there's a lot, obviously it's theorizing because we can't get clear data on it, but the theories are that it is this conflicting information. It's the overload of the need to be performative within social media environments. And again, those things won't impact those people so much who have a stable identity. So so when you look at social media data for teenagers, for example, sometimes it'll say, well, it's really damaging, it causes depression, anxiety. Some data says, well, no, it's not. What happens is it's those that are already prone to anxiety and depression who are more likely to become anxious and depressed. That also fits within the same um, holder, as it were, as identity. And identity coherence or incoherence, which are not very elegant words, but theoretically they
Yeah.
say it. And what I found slightly unsettling, embarrassing, whatever you might say, as someone that has worked with people across the spectrum and had this amazing opportunity to see people in so many different environments over the last 25 years. When we moved from the UK to the US 3 years ago, I completely fell apart. And that kind of has really brought my focus onto this topic even more, is because I knew all this stuff and I understood it, but I actually didn't have a very stable sense of self. And then I look back and I can see times in my life when it's happened before. When I went to university, I traveled around the world on my own, but it felt uncomfortable in ways that weren't always a growth oriented discomfort, but an actual terrifying discomfort. Um, I really struggled becoming a parent. And it's piecing it together backwards. But I think you know, knowing and doing are very different things. And I can be knowing quite a lot about this, but it doesn't mean I'm living it myself.
But we have to experiment on ourselves a lot of the time to make sure that whatever it is we talk about actually works. I think that's foundational,
Well,
and
I don't think
I've
I've done that
experienced the
enough,
same thing.
clearly.
It's a journey, right? What about childhood? The stories that we absorb in childhood about who we are and or what's important and what we are able to do and who we are not going to become. How important are those scripts that we inherit?
They're massively important. And um, in my second book, which is called Mirror Thinking, How Role Models Make Us Human, it's effectively explaining how everyone's a role model, everyone's influencing us. And when you're a child, those influences are very unconscious. They're normal. You know, we don't think, oh, this is a belief. We think this is how I think because this is normal. This is what normal is for me. It's like the air we breathe. We're not consciously aware of it. And so we're absorbing a huge amount. Um, what is interesting is uh, for young children, that they're, you're trapped in an environment, and that's why it can create certain protective parts of us that then overcompensate. But those in themselves create scripts, mental scripts that influence the way our life sort of turns out and the way we talk to ourselves and the stories we believe, the narrative we believe. Um, as we get older, sometimes the rebellion against certain scripts can be more formative than when we absorb scripts unconsciously. So, for example, if someone looks at, I'll give you an example. So in medicine, when a junior doctor has a more senior doctor who's unethical, it could go one of two ways. It could be that they unconsciously absorb that and think that that's normal. It, but often people push back against that and they say, I do not want to be like that. When I am more senior, I will not be unethical, or I will not treat people like that. And that becomes almost a firmer script and a more solid ground than if you simply absorb something.
Makes a lot of sense. I've seen both in my own experience. Um, so, if there are any parents out there, how can we tell better stories to our kids? Do you have any tips for how we? Because I heard someone say the voice in your head was given to you by your parents. It's that little voice that says, "Brad, you're doing it again. You always make this mistake." I'm not sure if it does come from my parents or not, and I don't have it that much of the time. But for some people, there is that lingering voice that's always criticizing them. Is there something we can do as parents to build better stories, better identities for our kids?
Yeah, and I think it's important for parents to realize that it's not necessarily the scripts that they're telling their children. It can come from all sorts of different influences. It can be a teacher. It can be something that got overblown by a perception as a child because, well, um, for example, if you've had a bad morning as a child and then your art teacher praises someone else's art and not your own, that could then make you, as a child, think, I'm not very good at art. That's a story you've created for yourself, which you then may perpetuate. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a voice that comes from externally. And parents are not responsible for every single negative message that lands on a child. Um, I think there are things to be aware of. I think if I think about the book on mirror thinking, it's being conscious of when you do things wrong, because of course you're going to do things wrong. It's actually just talking that through. So I'll give you another example. I remember when my kids were little, I tried not to swear in front of them. It doesn't happen now because they're a bit older. Um, but occasionally, like if someone pulled out in front of me in the car, I might swear.
Yeah.
And what I would do, having been going through the process of writing the book, would be, oh, that was bad. Mummy shouldn't have said that. Oops, I made a mistake. And so it sounds silly, but it's like literally verbally acknowledging that I did something wrong. So I'm maybe not even calling it bad because you're then giving it I did something that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it. That's okay. And it's also then showing them how you're responding to that mistake because you're role modeling that as well. So I think there's things like that. So you can, because we're always making mistakes as humans, but particularly as parents, and it gets magnified. So there's that piece. And then there is the actual literally telling the story of and getting your child to tell a story back to you. So what do you think you're really good at? What are the things that make you feel good? What are the things that make you happy? So looking at worth from the perspective of who you are rather than, so actually not even what you're good at, but it's really who are you? Who
Mm.
are you and what gives you joy and what makes you laugh, and helping them to understand that worth and connect with that worth, because that's the absolute foundation to everything, is that solid sense of I matter and I am worth something beyond what I'm good at or bad at. Just as me, I matter. um, and so those are the sorts of messages I think are most helpful.
Mm. So being able to tell a good story and help share a story of how someone is evolving, it's something that I do a lot with my daughter. Just help her recognize her strengths and the things that she
Brilliant.
loves, not necessarily even strengths, competencies. It's like you love creativity. You're a creative person. It's amazing. And, maybe you got some feedback about maths or something else. That's okay. That's absolutely fine. You are still this person who has worth. It's
Mhm.
interesting. The word worth, the word values comes from valere, which means to be worth, which is quite interesting.
That's really
Uh,
interesting.
Mm. So telling better stories, and I think this can work well for leaders too, because we are in a time where there's
Absolutely.
an abundance of information and a scarcity of meaning. Whereas if a leader can tell a really good story about, well, we've been here, this is where we started, we're here right now. Think the hero's journey. We're just at that
Mm.
point right now where we're going through the major test, and there is going to be a time for recovery and rejuvenation, and we're together. It just changes the situation from everything's uncertain and everything's going to go bad, which is default for many.
Absolutely. And it testing my American history, which is not very good. So I will not name the president. But there was a president in the Great Depression who told a story, and it had a massive impact on the economy of the country at the time, because those stories from leaders can change people's outlook on everything, what they buy, how they live, what decisions they make, whether you feel safe to invest in a mortgage or not. All those sorts of things come down if we're talking about political leadership. But a lot of the leaders I work with are in organizations. And the thing that they often forget is A, that they are a role model. B, they then think that means they have to be perfect, which it doesn't. And C, that they need to keep communicating that story, because while they know it, it doesn't mean that everyone else knows it. And even if they've told the whole organization yesterday, 50% of them won't have been listening. 20% of them probably, they've forgotten what he said or she said. And so it's a case of retelling that story over and over again, which to a leader can feel a bit laborious, because they're like, but don't, I've said it once. But it's
Hmm.
like, no, you have to keep telling that story. And it's a bit like, if you think about it with small children, you've got your daughter, I don't know how old she is, but when they're younger, is everything going to be all right, mummy or daddy? Yes, yes, it's going to be all right. Are you sure everything's going to be all right? Yes, it's going to be all right. Do you think it will turn out okay? And so it's you, thinking of not in a patronizing way, because I really believe in an adult to adult relationship with leader and follower, but it's thinking about needs of a population of followers as children. And that's that they need that reassurance. They need to be told more than once. They need all of those things that we kind of take for granted adults don't really need.
And if your people are in a state of fear about what's going to happen next, they perhaps end up in a freeze state, and nothing gets done. So from the leader's perspective, actually being that the calmest person in the room, being the one who tells the story that says, look, I don't have all the answers, but I believe, this is the vision. We're part of a group who's doing something great, connecting back to the mission and the values and the purpose. Well, can at least ignite some momentum, get people back into a state where they can focus and feel a bit more coherent. So there's individual stories and individual identities, but then the collective one really matters as well. And maybe that's part of the problem, is the collective identity is so incoherent.
I think you're absolutely spot on, and I think that comes again to this fact that we've lost a sense of community because we don't have the shared stories. It all comes back to stories, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Religion has shared story, but even if you're not religious, there are shared stories within community. And so if that's fractured, you lose that. And then the same way as in an organization, if you're not having that shared story, you're not repeating those stories to one another, then it is it means that everyone is their own island. And that is, as we know, it's really threatening and it's really unsettling.
Hmm.
So, yes, I think you're absolutely spot on.
I've got friends over in the US, your part of the world, where one is, far left, one is far right, whatever the labels mean nowadays. I'm not quite
Mm.
sure anymore. And they're wonderful people. And in fact, I know that they would get along incredibly well, but they would never sit down together just because they've got this idea of a story that the other one has different beliefs or attitudes or whatever it is. But when it comes to the basic core things, they're kind, they're loving people, they're intelligent, they're creative. And there's, in fact, the business model in there. It probably sells more news if there's conflict
Oh, yeah,
between groups, right?
absolutely. We know that, don't we? So it does. And I think that I don't want to get political, but talking about popularism, so regardless of whether we're talking right or left, that plays into that.
Mm.
And actually, I can get political on UK politics because I think that's okay. Um, if you look, if you look at what's happening in the Reform Party, there's been a request by there's a horrible stabbing in the UK. Um, uh, a, a s- a- and it inflamed sort of that the police were racist or anti-racist or whatever you want to say. And the parents of the young man who died said, "We don't want to make a big deal of this. We don't want to bring it up. Please, can we, be understanding and be rational and be considerate?" And the leader of the Reform Party basically has just stoked it as a fire and an opportunity to rile people up.
Mm.
Um, and as I said, I don't want to get political. So that's as
Yeah.
political as I'm going to get. But I
Mm.
think that's interesting as well, where we feel we can't talk about politics now. But it is interesting how it does, uh, well, it fuels fear, doesn't it? And once you're fueling fear, people aren't operating from a position of openness and curiosity and understanding.
Mm. If anyone's sitting out there thinking, so I'm not quite sure what my identity is, do you have any tips or can you point them where they could go? And one of your books is certainly a great place, but to really uncover or excavate or find out who it is that they are.
I think it's a journey in itself. So it's not like a quick um, a quick sit down and find the answer thing. I think it's something that we're all discovering all the time. It's about, as we just used the word curiosity, it's about being curious. It's about understanding. It's not judging. It's holding things lightly, it's exploring, and it's trying to. I always talk about it as understanding your story from the perspective of a detective. Now, I have been doing this for the last 3 years, having been a hypocrite beforehand. So I do now do this, but it's going in and really thinking about your life in that, holding it lightly and exploring and trying to understand as if you're a detective. You're not jumping to conclusions. You're just thinking about, well, these points of my life, these highs and my lows, what do they tell me? You know, what brought them on? Was that because I didn't feel stable in myself? Was it because of external like influences? What was that about? What can I learn from that? What can I take from that? And piecing and continually piecing it together, but not in a way that's hard work. As soon as it
Mhm.
becomes hard work, I think, um, I do think it's a lot easier to do with someone else. And I think the framework or the guardrails need to be the same. It needs to be held lightly. It needs to be obviously in a space of trust. It needs to involve curiosity. But you can sit down with a friend and you can explore, you can draw your timeline, you can look at your personal narrative. So your story, what stories do you tell about yourself? Where have they come from? What do they say about you? So I think there's lots of different ways to do it, but I think the emphasis on it's not judgmental. There's no right or wrong. You haven't done anything wrong. Other people, I'm sure, didn't intentionally do things wrong. I know we have harm done to us at times that is intentional. Um, and treating it like a fun, playful exploration.
I love that you said the timeline because that can be such a valuable way of just connecting the dots from now all the way through to the young version of yourself. And I used to almost resent a younger version of myself. I would be sitting there thinking, you wasted so much time. Like, what were you doing? You spent a couple of years in this burnt out phase doing nothing, and you could have been productive. And that's just a story in itself. If I hadn't been that person who went through that, I would never have gone traveling. I probably would never have written the books. I probably would never have gained the confidence that I could be a travel writer for a while and all of these other things that ultimately led to where you are. And the story does actually have a whole lot of coherence, but it just requires spending the time it doesn't, as you said, doesn't have to be hard. I think a great activity, two people get together with a friend, good for you anyway, and talk about your respective timelines. You'll learn about each other and reflect back. I love that
Mhm.
exercise so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's hard, isn't it? Because we do look back and we do judge. And but
Yeah.
when you were talking then, the other thing I was going to suggest is, I don't know if you've heard of internal family systems. It's a therapeutic approach um, developed by a therapist called Schwartz, and he has written a book called No Bad Parts. And I think it's a very helpful way of looking at yourself, not as a single entity, but as in the parts that have developed as we've grown older, whether that's a part that's grown to protect us at some point, whether it's a part that has grown to uh, be more exploratory, but it's recognizing and understanding those parts that make up the whole. And then he describes self with a capital S, so the big self that's underneath it all, our sort of true essence. But
Mhm.
it's the way he's written the book is something you can explore on your own, you can explore with a friend. And there are a lot of therapists who now use IFS. And if it's done well, I think it's a fantastic way of exploring identity.
Mm. Now, I know resilience is a topic that's close to your heart. What are some myths about resilience that you've learned from actually being up close with people in ICU, especially during the lockdowns during COVID? What does resilience mean to you? What have you discovered?
Well, I was researching resilience because I've written some medical papers on it as well. It's it's really interesting because there isn't a single agreed definition in academic literature, but in essence, it's about bouncing back. But I think the thing that's important to realize is that you don't necessarily bounce straight away. You might linger on the ground for a little bit before, if you think about tennis, someone comes and pops you back up again. Um, and that's okay. It's it is about not breaking. So it's not like you fall on the floor and then that's it. You don't get up again. But I think we are all more resilient than we realize. Um, and there's a really interesting researcher called Professor George Bonanno, who's actually has been on my podcast, but he's done a lot of research on resilience, which is fascinating. And I advise people to explore his work. But he looks at the post-traumatic growth, and he looks at people that are involved in 9/11, people that have suffered extraordinarily horrific injuries and accidents, um, and how there is that possibility for growth following a really traumatic event. And that in and of itself, I think, shows resilience. Um, I think a big factor of resilience is the reliance and dependence, open dependence on other people. And
Mm.
so, returning to your actual question, sorry, what did I see with working with ICU workers? I think some of them are so that they work as a team. They have to work as a team. That's what you do in hospital. That's what you do in ICU. But some of them have become so sort of stoic and uh, proud of their ability to cope that whilst they work as a team, they wouldn't necessarily have always shown their vulnerability willingly. And I think the pandemic encouraged that. It made it happen. And it shows that when people can share an experience, they can share tiny little things on a day to day basis, it changes that experience dramatically. Um, and, we know more and more research coming out about how important it is to be connected and all that sort of stuff. But you see it in action in those environments. Um, and so I think that would be absolutely core.
Mm. Do you think that resilience can be trained as such? And I've been involved with training programs. What are your thoughts on learning the skills proactively rather than just growing from experience?
I think you can learn the skills. I do think you can learn skills, but I do think this comes back to identity. If you're building skills on an incoherent identity, they're not going to withstand pressure. They may help, but when it really, really sort of comes down to it, particularly in like really awful situations, they're not going to stick. Um, and so that's where, again, I think it comes back to this sense of identity, which rests, as we were talking about children earlier, it rests on worth. You matter, you're worth something. And it comes, that sort of is the foundation to everything.
That's exactly why I embarked on the journey of exploring topics like values. I'd been training resilience for about a decade, and I realized that there was something missing, and it was the story, it was the connecting with the why and the identity that shapes who you are as an individual or a group under the pressure that requires resilience. Because if you've got a coherent story, well, what is the saying? He with a strong why can overcome any how, or whatever it is. But it's true, right? So, and those stories can, I guess, be emergent. As in COVID, suddenly we're forced into this situation where we've got no choice except to be there to support people in crisis at a level that we had never experienced before. But you can also craft that story in advance. I think that's one of the keys.
I think it is. I think it comes back to the piece we were talking about, is that exploration and the personal narrative and the timeline, your lifeline. Um, it's pulling all those pieces together of yourself and accepting them. So, I don't want to keep playing on what you said, but you said I sort of wasted. At one point, you thought you'd wasted 2 years, but then realised you
Yeah.
hadn't. And I think we all have that view. We look at bits of our life and we think, "Oh, why did I do that?" Or "I shouldn't have done this." Um, and it's those stories. It's correcting them and saying, "No, that is what happened. That is part of my story, and that's okay."
Mm. Do you think, particularly in the ICU and in a healthcare context, this is an opportunity for AI to play a part in terms of reducing the administrative burden on all of these people so that they can focus on healing and looking after people as opposed to documentation, which I've heard it really could lead you to burnout?
I think there's the opportunity. I look at the NHS in the UK and I think it's
Mm,
such a complex system with so many bureaucracies.
mm,
The practical implications of how it could actually take that burden, I think are very complex. It's the interplay of human system and AI. Um, Idealistically, yes, it'd be amazing.
yeah.
and uh, it, so in theory, yes. In practice, I would just wonder how how quickly it would be possible to do that.
Yeah, there's definitely and there's a lot of resistance too. From what I hear, working with organizations, there are even people actively sabotaging AI efforts because, of course, you don't want to be replaced. So why would you make it easy for that tool to be introduced to your workplace? There's probably a story in there as well. If someone is interested in your work, where would you recommend they start? With defining you or with mirror thinking, or depends on what they're after?
Yeah, I guess it depends what you're after. Both books, I've put lots of references to other people's work because, no one creates these things on their own. And I think that's one of the things I love doing, is going down a route and looking to see, well, where else where's this come from and what does that mean? So those, even if it was looking for other things, but yes, of course, I would love people to explore my work with those. And then I have Substack, which is called Still Human. And it's written in, I would like to say, an op-ed style, but it's looking at psychology. And so I write that every other week. And
Excellent.
that's, yes, so Still Human by Fiona Murden.
Excellent. All the links will be in the show notes. Any final thoughts for those who stuck with us to the end, who are curious in you as a person, or any messages that you'd like to share?
I think if you're listening, remember you have worth, you matter. Sounds corny. Um, Try and hold that to your heart, and live to that as the foundation, and then start exploring. I'm more than happy to answer questions or for people to reach out via Substack or on my website, which is just my name as well. Um, I love people. I love people's stories, and I would love to help any way I can.
Fiona, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure connecting. And everyone, do check out all of the links to Substack, website, books will all be in the show notes. We'll see you next time.